Hello, thank you for joining us today for Why Business Analysts Wear Capes. Before we get started, I want to cover some general housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to rewatch on IIBA.org within the next few business days. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat box. We will answer as many questions as possible. And now we'd just like to jump right into it. Because we've all experienced COVID-19. It's disrupted business and daily life for the world. For businesses that have had to rapidly adapt to the new normal, this is something that no one had ever experienced to this degree before. Other businesses that were forced to close had to rethink, reevaluate, and redefine how they would do business when it was time to reopen. Business analysis has played and continues to play a key role in helping businesses reset. Today, we are pleased to welcome our guest speakers who have firsthand experience in COVID-19 reopening plans and are going to share with us some of the challenges and opportunities they've faced. So before anything else, let me introduce our panelists for today. So we have Adrielle Howling and Lavanya Reddy. For those of you that aren't familiar with IIBA and are joining us for the first time, IIBA is a professional association dedicated to supporting lifetime learning opportunities for business and professional success. Through a global network, IIBA connects with over 29,000 members and more than 300 corporate members and 120 chapters. As a recognized voice of the business analysis community, IIBA supports the recognition of the profession and discipline and works to maintain the global standard for the practice and certifications. I'd also like to take this moment to remind everyone who hasn't already registered for BBC that it starts next week. It's virtual. There's still time to register to attend. All of the sessions will be recorded so you can watch them on demand. There's some excellent new features this year, like analysts after work, practitioner chats, and other great things, including IIBA's reception, where we will have an IIBA Trivia Bowl contest for all attendees. It's going to be a lot of fun. So please check the website for more information. And if you are an IIBA member, remember you get 20% off the registration price. So again, I'd like to introduce Adrielle and Lavanya. And they're going to tell you each a little bit about themselves and some of the work that they're involved in. So let's get started by hearing from Adrielle about the volunteer work you are involved with in Canada and how you've introduced researchers to business analysis.
Thank you. So first off, I just want to thank Anne and Rosalind and Mariah and the organizers of this webinar, as well as the IIBA for the opportunity to speak today, not only to share with the community of business analysts my experience with the COVID-related initiative in Canada, but also to share the stage with Lavanya and to hear about her experience with a very important COVID-related initiative in the United States. If you could flip to the next slide, please. So before I begin, I also want to take the time to quickly thank the sponsors and the partners of Covid-19 Resources Canada, and more specifically, the Trottier Foundation in Quebec, who has provided us with generous funding to continue our support efforts for this second wave of COVID-19. Next slide. So Covid-19 Resources Canada is a grassroots initiative which we started in mid-March as part of the Canadian response to the Covid-19 pandemic. Our focus was, and still is, to provide researchers with resources to support their research efforts for COVID-19, and in large part through our website, covid19resources.ca. At the start, we were all volunteers. And as we move towards and are now in the second wave of the pandemic, we are now set up as a hybrid organization. So part volunteer and part hires, still working towards this one common goal. Next slide, please. Currently today, our website consists of 6 platforms. I could probably spend an hour talking about our website, but in the interest of time, let me focus a bit on the volunteer database, our research databases, and Science Explained. Next slide, please. So from the start of the pandemic, we recognized the importance of mobilizing people to support the response to the pandemic in Canada. This volunteer database is essentially a space where skilled individuals from across Canada Canada can sign up to help with COVID-related opportunities. For example, diagnostic testing, contact tracing, tracking key statistics, and beyond this and at a more community level to help with food banks and shelters. Working with different organizations, we've been able to connect volunteers with many different initiatives to support the pandemic in Canada. Today, our database has over 5,000 volunteers, and there's a wide, diverse backgrounds with these volunteers, and you can see this based on some of the demographics we show on our website. So, and we continue to grow as we continue to meet the needs of the pandemic in Canada. So our organization was built out of the self-empowerment of Canadians, ourselves, who recognize the need to help support the response to the pandemic. We see the volunteer database as an extension of our brand story, so to speak, where we are using our position now to empower other Canadians to do the same. Next slide, please. Our research databases represent a central location where researchers can view up-to-date and accurate information about research opportunities, funded research, and to connect with other experts. Now, this information can sometimes be found by scouring the web, looking at university websites, but this also requires time and patience. And by listing the information in one place, we ensure researchers have quick and easy access to accurate information they need to see what research is upcoming and ongoing, so they can build on ideas and avoid duplication of work. It also allows researchers to connect with one another on projects where specific expertise is required. All of this is key because it translates into a streamlined approach for research, which drives the work being done for COVID-19. Since our core team is very Ontario and Quebec-centric, we've also ensured we connect with researchers outside of these provinces, often from our volunteer database, so we can ensure we connect with all researchers from across Canada, based on the community needs that they serve. So we know this is important because the effects of COVID-19 are different from region to region in Canada. What's been happening in Montreal, Quebec, where I live, is certainly very different than, say, St. John's, Newfoundland, or in the north, or in the west, like Vancouver, British Columbia. Next slide, please. So Science Explained is a newer addition to our website. This section was built out of the need to address misinformation about COVID-19. In this digital age, it can get often confusing to know what's true and what's false, especially as we get bombarded by information from social media. Science Explained is where we take suggested topics brought to us through social media or our connections, and we write about them to clear up confusion and to communicate with the public about COVID-19 related topics which matter to them. Our articles are published in multiple languages to achieve our objective and to reach our audiences. And we often rely on the volunteers within our database to help with the translation. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrielle, for your efforts. Your efforts highlight the importance of business analysis working with other lines of business to improve project success. Lavanya, now I'd like to ask you to talk to us a little bit about the steps that you took to plan the reopening of the University of North Carolina in Charlotte in preparation for fall 2020 classes. And if you can also talk a little bit about yourself.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much. And greetings, everyone. Thank you, Rosalind, Anne, and Mariah for setting up this webinar and giving me the opportunity to share space with my fellow BA Adrielle. I am excited to be in the company of such accomplished individuals and share my experience practicing business analysis. I have been practicing business analysis with various titles for over 16 years now across various industries, most recently in the higher education domain. And I was also asked to share something interesting, something fun about me in the introduction. I don't know how many of you will find this fun or interesting, but in the beginning of this year in January, my children challenged me to read 100 books by the end of the year, by December. I am on my 16th book, so now you know who is not winning the challenge. that being said, to answer Anne's question about the steps that were taken for the reopening of the university, I want to begin with saying that it wasn't just me alone. Rather, it was a team of team formed for the solution delivery that was part of this project, and was assigned and involved in accomplishing this impossible task of putting a command center together for the university in less than 4 weeks. Universities across the country have set up emergency response teams for the unexpected in the wake of national tragedies like 9/11, campus violence, national disasters, and now COVID-19 crisis. This pandemic has almost tested the limits of these response teams. My university, although it has been at the forefront of some of the most proactive responses to the virus by doing things such as assisting the on-campus students moving out of their dorms, setting up online environments for teaching and learning, the process has been quite challenging. Could you move to the next slide, please? So here is an example that I borrowed from New York Times. This is a graph showing the number of positive cases tested across the country in various universities and colleges. And this graph is updated quite frequently. I think these numbers reflect the numbers from this week. So coping with COVID in universities is particularly complicated because the universities have such a wide variety of functions. If you take our university, we are like a mini city. We have our own police force, we have our sports center, our energy plants, and then the university performs a variety of civic functions. We are also a local, a major employer locally, so we are an important driver into the local economy. So these disparate entities and identities meant a large number of stakeholders that we had to consider when building the system and putting this project together. In addition to that, the university revenue model itself is quite complex. It is not just tuitions. It is government funding, endowments, alumni donations, merchandise sales, even ticket sales, collaborations and partnerships with corporations, media production. So coming to grips with COVID was not such an easy task. Next slide, please. So along with a large number of internal and external stakeholders, if you just considered our end user group, that was also quite varied and quite unique and distinct, right? If we took just the students, if you just consider the students, there were several variations of that user groups. We have students who are full-time, who are part-time, who live on the campus, who live outside the campus, students who are faculty, students who are employees, and vice versa. So coming up with a list of comprehensive user-based scenarios and identifying and designing that user experience was not an easy undertaking, given the amount of time we had. So we started with coming up with the preparedness goal. What did we want? What was the objective of this project? So we identified that the goal was going to build an integrated command center for the organization that can ensure safety and keep the essentials going while establishing effective and strong strategic decision-making systems, which would support tactical immediate decisions as well as long-term future decisions.
Thank you, Lavanya. Your agile approach has allowed you to adapt to COVID-19 changes in student behaviors. Based on your experiences, if we can go to the next slide. Based on your experiences, how important is adaptability when managing a COVID-19 related project? And if you could each share a scenario in your project where adaptability was needed. Adrielle, we'll start with you.
Certainly. So Adaptability is very important, especially in the context of COVID-19. And in many ways, it can be said that there's nothing predictable about COVID-19. So the only thing that is predictable is perhaps its unpredictability. But to speak more accurately, at the start of the pandemic, we actually knew very little about the virus. And with the hard work and dedication of researchers, we now know more. But we still face challenges to put appropriate action into place to manage the pandemic from both a public and an organizational standpoint. So it's not so much that adaptability was needed, but that it continues to be needed as we face the second wave of the pandemic in Canada. So we are continuously adjusting our strategies, re-identifying, resetting priorities. And in this context as BAs, it requires us to be adaptable, probably in more ways than we've had to before, especially when it comes to delivering and improving processes. So for COVID-19 Resources Canada, we were actually born out of the pandemic, meaning that we've known nothing other than having to work in a very adaptable and agile environment. So we are a cross-Canada team and we connect on Zoom and on Slack, and most of us have never actually met in person. Yet, we've built a bond that kind of makes us like a family. So our start, our geographic locations, and the continuing impact of COVID-19 are what make it not only important, but impossible to act in any other way than to be adaptive. And while we've also had challenges initially to work in this environment, we've grown more conditioned to it through the pandemic. So conditioned in the sense that, well, at the start, I would say our team was maybe unfamiliar with the skills and expertise that a BA can bring to a project. Over time, though, there's been more acceptance and flexibility for the recommendations I've brought to the team in my role as a BA, as I demonstrated techniques and tools which have provided simplicity and comprehension to what would otherwise have been a very overcharged and hectic environment. In doing so, I essentially have created buy-in and engagement of stakeholders to stick with processes which have been adapted to our agile environment. So while I've already talked a bit about adaptability of our initiative in a general sense, I would also like to quickly share a story, the moment where we needed super adaptability in our response to COVID-19. And it's what we now refer to as the creation of COVID-19 Resources Canada. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in mid-March, the World Health Organization, as you may recall, announced that the COVID-19 outbreak was in fact a pandemic. So what happened next, and what we can see on the slide, is that in response, two Canadian researchers, so Tara Moriarty and Guillaume Bourque, launched into action on Twitter with a shared idea to create some sort of space to help support researchers in their response to the pandemic in Canada. This idea actually snowballed quite quickly into a nationwide conversation that led to the volunteer grassroots initiative and website COVID-19 Resources Canada, which provides resources to researchers to support their efforts. While our website continues to evolve with the BA support I provide to adapt to this ever-changing environment, we cannot discount the super adaptability that occurred to get this website up and running, especially if we consider that this all happened within the time span of 1 week. Thank you.
Thanks. Lavanya, can you also share a scenario in which adaptability was needed?
Definitely, and I really enjoyed the quick anecdote that Adriel shared. I mean, that proves that how a small idea can just snowball into a global movement. That's a great question about adaptability, and as Adriel mentioned, yes, that's become like an essential skill. I remember, I'll share a personal story. I remember I read an article published by Harvard Business Review in 2011, which basically summarized that adaptability was trending as the new competitive advantage. Here we are 9 years later, and today I think it has become an essential quality that is required for any form of success. If you see, even our children have had to quickly adapt in the last 8 months, a new form of learning, new method of going to school. So I think it has become quite critical just for survival, I guess. The university, in our case, the university did a spectacular job of coaching us through that emotional curve, we were first in denial that the virus is in Wuhan, China. It is not going to come to Charlotte, right? And then 2 months into it, all of us were going through a tremendous phase of frustration. And the next stage was being in that proverbial valley of despair. So our university and management did quite a good job of coaching us through, pulling us out of that valley of despair and coaching us through the process of acceptance. So I see adapting to the new working environment, quickly adjusting to the new systems, processes, and structures as a sign of acceptance, as a sign of commitment to the organization goals. One of the examples I would share with you is I am used to writing 70 to 100 pages of business requirements document. I'm used to using Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs as my requirements inventory. I had to let go of all of those for this COVID response project. I mean, that did not make sense. That did not fit into the operating model, because we had to make decisions dynamically on the go and in increments. There is a notion that higher education is not nimble or not flexible. How can that be true? I mean, I think we were one of the first areas in the world, education itself, higher education or education itself, to switch things quickly to a virtual environment. Something that would have traditionally taken at least a year to accomplish, but we set up virtual learning environments, virtual teaching environments, and working environments in a matter of days. That itself shows adaptability of the industry itself, and the people who were engaged in that process. We changed our mindset from perfecting the process to putting the user in the front and center of it. Asking repeatedly the question, what do our students need, and who they are, and what do they need? Because we have significant population of students who feel the most comfortable being on the campus, who feel the most safe being on the campus. So moving everything virtual or having online learning classes would not have served this population group. So we had to identify all these variations of user experience and use that as our driver for building a system that would deliver the most value. Could you advance to the next slide, please? One way of doing this was breaking down the business needs into actionable items. So when we tried to break down the scope, there were 4 buckets it fit into. One was the discover, decide, design, and deploy. In the discover bucket, it was basically just identifying all these user experiences and user scenarios and putting together stories associated with these variations. Again, putting the student in the middle of it, in the center of it, and getting inputs from leaders, senior leaders, from the staff, faculty, from parents, from alumni, and from the students themselves. Then came the decision-making part, where we had to decide who was doing what, when, and how. Again, remember, our idea was to do good now, which was better than perfecting later. So with the good amount of information, we wanted to move faster and move to the next stage. The next bucket was designing a portfolio of actions to support each party involved in making those decisions. So what data would they need? How are they going to interact? What tools or systems do they need to perform those actions? Those were the decisions that needed to be made, and that fit in that bucket. And finally came the bucket of deploying. So traditionally, we are used to going big bang and deploying a complete, fully functional end-to-end systems, but we had to switch course, and we had to deliver solutions in small shippable pieces, in small increments. We were willing to endure smaller failures rather than big ones in the later.
Thank you. That's great information. I actually wanted to ask our attendees today a poll question. So So if you can bring up the first poll. So if you can each just select the answer that you think resonates. Are there lessons learned and elements from the pandemic that will be useful when COVID-19 is over? I'll give you a few seconds to answer this. Okay, we've got about 60% of people have voted. So if we can close that. Yeah, so our poll results are showing that 94% of people agree with this statement. We can move to the next slide. So what were the VA tools and techniques that you found yourself using most often in your project? Adriel, if you can share if there was anything significantly different between this project and earlier projects that you worked on in terms of usage of tools and techniques.
Sure. Can you advance the slide one? So I'd say in the first few months of our initiative, I found myself mapping a lot of processes for our organization. So for example, as I'm showing on this slide, I used a mind map to map our organizational structure. So on other projects, I probably would have taken the time to build a structured diagram, but because our team was growing so fast and individuals often had multiple roles, the mind map actually was a much better option, not only to represent the cross-team involvement, but I also found it much easier to update as our organization continued and continues to grow and branch out as we connect with other organizations from across Canada. The mind map is also useful in the sense that it truly represents our organizational structure. So we don't follow a top-down approach in our teams. As mentioned earlier, we are a self-empowered team, which means there's a lot of autonomy, hence the flat structure, and the support to teams is provided through servant leadership. So as a BA, when I work with teams, I work to find solutions and make recommendations. I certainly don't do anything without ensuring buy-in from key stakeholders. I don't think that this is necessarily different from past projects that I've been involved with, but I think I'm even more conscious about the importance of stakeholder engagement than before. Next slide, please. So as another example, I found myself mapping process flow diagrams, which is normal for a BA, but I was doing it on the fly using the web tool Lucidchart, which allows for collaboration in real time with team members. And this really allowed us to identify pain points and find solutions to streamline the work that the team was doing. And this was all done within the time span of 1 or 2 meetings. So in some cases, this meant softening the rules around process modeling, but this was really a good thing because it simplified the language and ensured engagement of team members for the activities. So this slide shows more finalized process flow diagrams, but I can confirm though that the initial drafts were much more rudimentary. So more recently, I've relied on other BA techniques as we were approaching the second wave of COVID-19 in Canada. If you can go to the next slide, please. So in July and August, I organized a lessons learned for our different teams to reflect on our experiences from the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada, which was in the spring. And I would say I did follow a similar approach as I would have on other projects, but there was a lot of autonomy with the exercise and teams really took to their roles well. So essentially I created a template with instructions that our teams leads then brought to their teams for brainstorming and completion. So as you know, with the lessons learned, teams were asked to define what worked, what didn't work in our first phase of the initiative. And the idea then was to make suggestions going forward that we could then use to identify key high-level activities that would be critical going forward to support the second wave of COVID-19, which at that point was predicted for the fall. So you could say that our flat org structure provided the empowerment needed to really drive this exercise, and I was always there to provide support as a BA in that role of servant leadership. So the results of the lessons learned were then brought to a central meeting, which we hold weekly for review and clarification. And then together, we actually applied a Moscow prioritization on the activities, which we then brought over into a Gantt chart to organize our timeline for the next 6 months. So since the fall has started, I have organized workshops to identify requirements needed for our website revamp. So we're doing this revamp because we want to improve the usability of our website, and we're thinking of including new platforms. The one that I can bring to mind or comes to mind is COVID discussions. And the idea with this platform is to connect communities and experts in COVID-19 discussions. So this is particularly important for remote and marginalized communities in Canada lacking access to expertise. So since efficiency is key, especially in this very adaptive, agile environment, I've taken the time to really prepare and organize for these meetings to ensure time is used efficiently with the teams. I ensure meeting notes then are succinct, action items are identified, and key takeaways are listed so we can drive the requirements forward for the revamp of the website. So I guess just to summarize, all of these techniques and tools that I've shared here, so the process modeling, the lessons learned, the requirements workshop, I would say that I initially put in a good amount of effort to build the processes and understanding of the tools with the team, which then allowed them to take on certain activities on their own. So recall that a BA, a business analyst, is anyone that performs a business analysis activity. So in that regard, as BAs, I think we should use our ability to engage stakeholders to empower them with some of our skills and knowledge to drive initiatives forward. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your lessons learned. Lavanya, can you tell us about some of the tools and techniques you found yourself using often in your project? And was there anything significantly different between this project and earlier projects you've worked on in terms of usage of tools and techniques?
Most certainly, and I want to compliment Adriel on the newsletter. I think it's a brilliant idea of sharing status with the team, and I like the graphics, so congratulations on that. I think I'm going to steal that idea in some of my projects. This project was not quite different for me. Fundamentally, it was not very different for me from most of the projects that I have worked on in the past. The circumstances definitely have been different, and the impact of the circumstances has forced me to make some changes. Obviously, collaboration, I'm sure everybody will agree that collaboration is key, and decisions have to be made dynamically in our projects. So that kind of drove the change, the way we do things from what we are used to, because we are still a traditional waterfall organization. We are used to writing hundreds of system shell type of system behavior oriented requirements, and that did not make sense in the COVID response project for me. So excuse me. Also, there was no current system that we could use as a frame of reference. This was going to be brand new. This was going to be built from scratch. So we had the creative license. We had the liberty of getting creative and use a method that would make the most sense in the current situation. We relied heavily on developing user scenarios. We put this again, as I mentioned earlier, we put the student in the middle, in the center of the scenarios, user experience, and built the scenario around the student. So in this slide, you will see that we have a user, and then we have attached attributes to this user. Those attributes were basically what is their relationship with the organization, how do they communicate with the organization, what information do they need to function in their role in their day-to-day jobs, and how will they communicate with the organization, what would be the medium or tool or system which would dissipate that information, what questions can we anticipate, and who is going to respond to those questions. So there were a lot of touch points that we had to envision. Along with that, we had to also identify in these touch points what were going to be human interactions versus what were going to be system generated interactions. So using these scenarios, using these personas and attaching scenarios to these helped quite a bit in getting the buy-in from the stakeholder, getting approval and comprehension from the stakeholders. This helped in sharing information easily rather than sending them a long list of Word documents where they had to review each sentence and read it line by line. So I got a better engagement and a better response using this as a tool. Along with that, as Adriel was mentioning, I also relied heavily on developing process maps. The process maps helped in identifying, organizing the work teams and the specific area of responsibility for those work teams. They also helped me identify what were the data elements that were required to trigger those actions and what actions are needed. University in general is known for seeking consensus and sharing the decision-making process. It is very rare that a single individual is making a decision unanimously. So having process maps with particular swim lanes, distinct swim lanes, helped me identify where the decision-making process is going to be and helped me design an expedited decision-making process, helped me identify what could be, anticipate what could be the choke points or what could be the bottlenecks, and then clearly define appropriate boundaries and enforcing responsibilities for each involved party. Could you advance to the next slide, please? Another tool that we used was developing mock-ups, what the user interface is going to look like. So here is an example of the daily survey that goes out to university constituents who are encouraged to actively participate and inform the university of their health. This was achieved, and it was, I mean, this was decided and designed in such a record time that because of these mock-ups, because we had a working model and the feedback and the edits were made immediately. So the decision-making process was so dynamic, again in small increments. So this is a very agile concept that we borrowed. Another practice that we set up was having a daily huddle at a regular set time. Again, this is a concept that was borrowed from the Scrum framework, which is an agile project development methodology. This helped us prioritize the work for the day, who is doing what and who is focusing on what, any hurdles that we have to overcome, and what will be the individual goals and team's goal for the week. Typically, it was run by the delivery team lead or by me, depending on the day. The overall, I mean, I can say that the communication, the collaboration, and the coordination that was required was much tighter than what we are used to.
Thank you for sharing. My next question is, as a business analyst, what has been the most challenging part of this project and how did you overcome it? Again, Adriel, we'll go to you first.
Sure. Let me just say it's just really nice to hear from Lavanya about the tools and techniques that you've used as well in your organization. So thank you for sharing that as well. So yes, challenging. I think that clearly describes everything that's going on right now with COVID-19. So in the case of Covid19 Resources Canada, we're a team of volunteers located across Canada. So just our sheer geographic location and the fact that we met and have always worked together virtually proved to be quite a challenge, especially at the start. But as every BA knows, a challenge is simply an opportunity to learn and adapt to the environments that we work within. So I met and I continue to meet this challenge by applying the 3 C's of business analysis. So curiosity, communication, and connecting the dots. So curiosity, and I believe this also kind of encompasses creativity as well, meaning taking those BA techniques and adapting them so that there's better dissemination and uptake of information from stakeholders. More specifically as it relates to our current landscape with COVID-19 and working in a virtual environment. So as I mentioned earlier, I was mapping current state diagrams on the fly to help our team identify major frustrations or pain points in their work. And then together we defined solutions to streamline and make their work for the future much more enjoyable and less painful. So that in itself is empowering, not only for me as the BA, but the team members I've worked with, and certainly a challenge worth facing. So in terms of communication, meaning that all stakeholders have a common understanding of the direction of the project. So in some cases, team members themselves were and are challenged by communication, especially when it relates to a fast-paced environment. So when things move quickly, even with the best of intentions, miscommunication happens. And this can cause inefficiencies, which when ignored will cause major frustrations among stakeholders and can even derail projects. So to ensure that this didn't or doesn't occur, I make sure confusion is clarified on activities or ideas as soon as they're formed. So sometimes it simply requires that I use active listening to synthesize and return information to achieve consensus at meetings or with emails. When it involves processes, I use diagrams quite often to clarify understanding and obtain consensus for the direction of activities going forward. And connecting the dots, meaning having that eagle-eye perspective of the project and anticipating issues before they happen. So in this regard, I ensure that I have a good understanding of the team. So their roles, their responsibilities, influences, and impacts on the initiative. It also means knowing the processes that we currently have in place and understanding how new ideas or activities could be integrated into our work. So in having this, eagle-eye perspective, I can identify potential gaps or redundancies that we can then address together as a team. And this really allows me to focus on capturing on those risks and acting on them before they turn into issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Levan, you're working in the academic environment. What was the most challenging part of this project, taking the entire university from in-person to virtual, and how did you overcome it?
Very similar to what Adriel just explained. I mean, the biggest challenge for anyone right now is this new way of working, right? The team environment, the conversations, the interactions and collaborations have all become online. They are digital. And so there is always a risk of misalignments of objectives, lack of collaboration. Sometimes I have had situations where I think my power cord in the laptop is still plugged in, but it is not plugged to the actual power source on the wall, and then right in the middle of the meeting my laptop dies. So I've had such faux pas happening to me during team meetings, critical team meetings. So I think the biggest challenge is just this new adjustment to this new working environment, and for us, especially in the higher education area, the data security itself had become like one of the critical factors that we had to consciously keep track of. To overcome these with my team, I had to make a conscious effort to show trust and confidence and check myself to make sure I didn't come across like I was micromanaging. I had to show them that I relied on them, I trusted them in getting the job done. It was a fine line, it was like a fine balancing act of trusting the team and not helicoptering them in the name of frequent check-ins, which is also quite essential to keep that rapport going, to keep that interaction going. Along with that, we also had very well-defined governance processes, oversight processes. We established some metrics to make sure that there were no gaps that were left in the analysis. Having a shared summary of tasks, just like Adrian described earlier, clarifying and getting an approval and having a clear picture of who is doing what and communicating that constantly helped tremendously in not leaving something on the table for someone to pick it up, but having an assigned list of tasks across the board in the team. I would also like to highlight some of the things that the leadership did to support us. They were particularly helpful too, since all of us are still solving similar problems in our personal lives too. So having relaxed working hours, softening the deadlines for non-critical projects. Our stakeholders were also quite supportive and showed empathy. So these small acts of kindness and understanding increase the confidence and increase the trust in the team. At the end of the day, if we felt burned out or if we felt dejected or tired or exhausted, mentally drained, our leadership did quite a good job of encouraging us and showing us that vote of confidence in the team, which was a tremendous boost to the team's morale.
Thank you. Yes, that's great advice. Really building trust and confidence and sharing empathy are more important now than ever. We have another poll question that we want to ask our attendees. So on a virtual transition of elicitation process, was it easier, harder, or the same? We'll give ourselves a few seconds to give everyone a chance to vote. Okay, we seem to have most people answered, and the results were 60% say that it's harder to do elicitation virtually. And I'm sure both of you found that in the work that you've done based on the experiences you've shared. Our next question, I wanted to, if we can cue the next slide. It is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So I want to ask each of you, what is your one piece of cybersecurity advice that you'd like to share with other business analysts? Adrielle?
Thanks, Anne. So, of course, cybersecurity is very important. We are living in a digital world, and there's no sign that this trend is going to slow down. In fact, with the pandemic, we are now even more reliant on technology, for example, simply to just connect with each other. That being said, as business analysts, I guess my cybersecurity advice would be to say that we need to know that cybersecurity is something that nobody can afford to ignore. So as BAs, we are agents of change, and in that regard, we are in a well-placed position to ensure cybersecurity receives the attention it deserves. So not only for the initiatives we're involved with, but also more broadly within the organization. So more specifically, I would say we need to ensure that the appropriate processes are in place to protect information as it relates to the risk of its disclosure. We also need to ensure that there's continuous improvement in these processes, where preventive and corrective actions are taken to minimize the risk for data breaches. So worth mentioning for this pandemic, the Canadian government actually issued a statement on September 14th to researchers and innovators in Canada. And I quote, they said, to take extra precautions to protect the security of COVID-19 related research, intellectual property, and knowledge development. So in this regard, as a BA working on a COVID-related project, I need to ensure that these risks are documented and they are communicated with key stakeholders so we can implement processes that ensure that the information on our projects are secured.
Thank you. Lavanya, can you share any advice you have for other business analysts that's cybersecurity related?
I don't consider myself to be qualified enough to give any sort of advice. I will share my approach on any project with respect to cybersecurity preparedness. I typically start with asking these two questions. How does cybersecurity enable the business? That's the first question. And the second question in my mind is, how does cyber risk affect the business? finding answers to these questions has allowed me to build the cybersecurity component into the project as an essential part of the project, not rather than as an afterthought, security for the sake of security. I recently obtained my cybersecurity analysis certification, and during the course of while I was preparing for the certification, while I was studying for the certification, I realized that I had a general awareness of what cybersecurity meant. Generally, when we talk about cybersecurity, the immediate thought that pops up into our mind is data and authentication. But studying for the certification, it just opened my mind to the several layers there are to cybersecurity. It is not just data, it is not just authentication, but there are the coursework organizes the various layers of cybersecurity into these key 8 knowledge areas that helped me understand how to apply and how to start thinking those security layers when I am working on a project. It helped me better understand the correlation between the risks and controls. So I gained a lot, and I think it was very beneficial for me to study for the certification and being certified.
Thank you. Congratulations on earning your CCA certification. That's fantastic. And thank you both for sharing your cyber safety and prevention tips. As you mentioned, there are many layers that are important to being aware of cyber risks. And we have one more poll question. If we can open that up. Because it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we wanted to ask each of you, what is your involvement with cybersecurity efforts in your organization? So I'll keep this open for a few seconds more to give everybody a chance to answer the question. Okay, I think I'll give it another moment. Okay, I think we can close it now. So the results are that 44% say their involvement is low, with 29% saying it's medium, 11% are high. So we are seeing, even in our 2020 IIBA Global Business Analysis Salary Survey, we saw around 36–38% of business analysts reported that they're involved in cybersecurity. So this is a newer field, an opportunity for BAs to become involved in, and we are seeing that growing, and there are lots of opportunities in that area. Wanted to move on to our next question, which relates to the topic of today's webinar. Adriel, why do you think business analysts wear capes?
And thanks, Anne. So as you can see, I actually am wearing a cape today. It's a little early for Halloween, but I thought it would be appropriate given the topic for today. So I will say this. So as it relates to Batman, I think that yes, BAs, we tend to operate in the shadows. So people often understand the role and function of a project manager who tends to stand front and center on a project, managing the scope and the budget and the time. For BAs, though, our role, while important, tends to be less understood. So we tend to operate more closely on the ground with stakeholders. So in the shadows, like Batman, clarifying processes, identifying requirements, and finding solutions. I believe that our skills and knowledge are extremely useful for supporting and advancing initiatives, especially as they relate to this pandemic. As BAs, and as I mentioned before, we adhere to the 3 C's, so curiosity, communication, and connecting the dots. And this allows us to find new ways to connect with our stakeholders as we face challenges with connecting remotely and other impacts of COVID-19. I think especially of the support we provide essential and frontline health workers. They are the real heroes in this pandemic. So by providing the support, are we as BAs also superheroes? If you ask anyone I'm involved with at Covid19 Resources Canada, and I know some of them are actually attending the webinar today, I'm sure they'll recognize the importance of business analysis and the success we've achieved to date. So even though they're on mute, I'm sure they're shouting out yes. But most BAs I've met, though, tend to be modest. So in that regard, I'll just shrug my shoulder and smile.
Thank you. Lavanya, can you share your thoughts on this?
I love how Adriel has represented the superpowers of BAs with her cape. So great job, Adriel. I totally agree with her. BAs probably have a lot in common with the caped crusaders, if you can call them that. Great BAs. So what differentiates, in my opinion, what differentiates a good BA and a great BA, or what differentiate a great BA from a good BA is the combination of those skills, right? The skills that Adrian just mentioned, just being plain and simple, being curious and having that inquisitive mind, asking a lot of questions, asking why repetitively, because it's only after the fourth and the fifth why that you start getting insightful and valuable information. Having excellent listening skills, I mean, not listening just for replying and responding, but listening to assimilate and absorb the knowledge like a sponge. And then building consensus. The BAs, we have a job to where we have to negotiate, we have to translate and be the mediator. So that's a skill that differentiates between a great BA and a good BA. And then eliciting information from various sources and identifying those sources itself is like a task in itself. So most importantly, I think effectively communicating the BA position to our bosses, to our leadership, management, our colleagues, our stakeholders and clients. I think a combination of these soft skills and technical capabilities gives us the superpowers. So as Adriel was saying, working in the shadows, being Clark Kent in the morning, but being superwoman or superman in the night.
Thank you. I think that's great. We actually ran a little bit longer with our panel discussion today, so we don't have a lot of time to answer the questions, but we do have some in the question box. And as I said, this session is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to rewatch it, and we will be answering your questions and getting back to you following the webinar. So I want to thank both of you for sharing the tools and techniques that you've used in your organizations, sharing your experiences and approaches that we can all take away with us to apply in our own work to adjust to the new normal. So we're going to jump into some of these questions, and if anyone has to drop off at 1 o'clock, we may run for a couple minutes longer to try to answer a few more questions. So the first question is, I'm going to direct this to you, Lavanya. Do you think being forced to make such quick and dynamic decisions will affect the speed and approach of your decision-making processes in the future?
Okay, could you please repeat that question?
Sure. Do you think being forced to make such quick and dynamic decisions will affect the speed and approach of your decision-making process in the future?
Yes, I think that, excuse me, I think that would definitely happen. As I was giving you an example earlier, there were occasions or there were situations where we had to make decisions on the fly and quite dynamically. So I see that happening in the future. I see that repeating in the future as well. For us, so far, good now has worked. It is a bit of an adjustment. It is a bit of a transition from moving away from that original way of doing things, right, to perfecting the process and gathering all the information, all the data, and capturing all the facts, moving away from that and capturing just enough and moving forward with the decision-making process with just enough information. It is going to be a new thing. It is going to be an adjustment. And I see that happening in the future quite often and quite frequently. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, you did. Thank you. Adriel, I have a question about getting decisions made virtually. Obviously, getting consensus on decisions is always a challenge in projects. How fast were decisions made in your initiatives, and how many stakeholders were engaged in making decisions?
So that's a very interesting question, and I guess it depends on where the decisions lay. So as I mentioned before, we are very autonomous. So what we've done with our our organization is that we have these team leads, and they are there to kind of guide the decisions of the teams. And so they need to decide then whether they can make a decision for their team. So example, the volunteer team, or whether that decision needs to come back to the central meeting that we have. So it kind of it depends questions. If they can answer it on their own, it's fine. But if they can't, they'll either bring it to the 1 p.m. meeting that we have on Mondays now. But we had, a couple days a week initially in the spring. And there's also, we're quite active on Slack. So it's an application that you can use to message, and we have different channels. So you can just pop your question in there and everybody is connected. And so the answers come quite quickly. So it's just a sense of knowing as a team lead, if you can make the decision on your own or whether it requires, further feedback from maybe people from the central admin team. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think that answers the second part of the question that I was going to ask, is if you had advice for how BAs can get decisions made faster, if they can get faster responses. And I think some of the tools you've shared would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, decisions coming faster means you kind of have to get buy-in from your stakeholders. So you need to prove to them that you are engaged, first of all, and then in return, they will, start to trust you more. And so doing so, then yes, decisions get made faster. And if you're able to effectively communicate, either using process diagrams or just by speaking your ideas, then obviously that means that things move a lot quicker.
I think we have time for one more question. Lavanya, do you have any tips or techniques that you would share for uncovering, the best way to elicit requirements or have conversations virtually?
I think organizing your thoughts before the meeting, having a list of questions or preparing an interview questions and sharing that with the appropriate parties who are going to participate in the elicitation session, that helps me a lot. That helps me keep the elicitation meeting focused, and it helps me meet the desired outcome of that meeting. And this is a trick that I learned during my when I attended a session at the last BBC on going prepared to the elicitation meeting and having interview questions already pre-distributed before the meeting. So I think having the tone and the direction of the meeting set beforehand helps a lot in making it the most productive requirements elicitation session.
Thank you very much. And as I said, we will attempt to answer all of the questions that we weren't able to cover during this webinar. Thank you both again for attending and for sharing your great experiences with everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for attending the webinar today.